A high altitude EMP attack is the worst case scenario for this country. We will lose the national electric grid. The electricity in this country is not coming back on for 2 years. No food, no grocery stores, no banking, no radio, no TV, no internet, no heat, no AC, no septic systems functioning. Nothing works. Our own arrogance and our dependence on electricity and the loss of our life skills is what kills us. You can see from foreign countries' war doctrines, this is first strike territory for World War III. There is zero plan at the United States government to deal with this kind of event. Russia is largely hardened against the EMP threat. China started a fast tracking program to harden their grid many years ago. They recognize that the future is EMP, that the future is cyber attacks on grids and infrastructure. I don't question for a second that they're going to hit that button and take us out.
Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. Well, it's an honor today to have on the channel Jonathan Hollerman, who's the Deputy Executive Director of the EMP Task Force on National and Homeland Security. Many of you are probably familiar with the late, great Dr. Peter Vincent Pry. We had him on the channel several times at the beginning of the war with Ukraine and Russia. He was an EMP expert, and Jonathan is following in his footsteps, and he hopefully is going to give us a fresh take on the fragilities, the vulnerabilities of our current power grid, what electromagnetic pulse affects, what we know about it, are our governments prepared for it, and what the aftermath, what exactly is that going to have on society as a whole. But you bring a very fresh perspective, and I also want to say you are an author of several books as well. You wrote a book called Survival Theory, A Preparedness Guide, How to Survive the End of the World on a Budget. So we're going to be talking about the hypothetical, but also you bring a practical skill set to this conversation as well. So thanks for coming on today.
Thanks for having me on, Nate. Really glad to be here.
So what can you tell us about electromagnetic pulse weapons? Maybe just for the beginner, and then we'll get into the more advanced stuff.
Sure. So there's 4 different ways a national electric grid, and this goes for Canada as well, could be brought down or destroyed. And those 4 methods are EMP, or nuclear high altitude electromagnetic pulse, a coronal mass ejection, or a solar, which is commonly referred to as a solar flare, a cyber attack against the grid, or a physical attacks against infrastructure. So if we're strictly talking about the nuclear EMP side, this is something that there's a lot of conjecture. There's a lot of discussion online about. There's a lot of YouTube videos, but a lot of the people discussing it don't have the background or the, I guess you could say, inside information as to the truth and the government testing. I was a member of the Electromagnetic Defense Task Force, which is a wargaming event, joint services, all the military branches, all your alphabet agencies, the DOE, some of the electric utilities were there. National Security Council, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and we basically war gamed the aftermath of an EMP and what would be the government's response. And that was a incredible event for me to be at. It was really eye-opening. I had no illusions as to the preparedness of the government for this type of event, but it was even shattered further if that was possible. So what is an EMP? It is a nuclear weapon that's detonated high in the atmosphere, typically around 300 kilometers above the Earth's surface. And if you detonate at that height over the middle of the country, you can hit both coasts, East Coast and West Coast, with one weapon. Typically, how this would be delivered is going to be off a cargo carrier in the Gulf of Mexico or a submarine in the Gulf of Mexico. A couple other points to consider. We have no southern missile defenses in this country. We have no way to shoot this rocket down if it is launched. All of our missile defenses are facing north, Cold War era, for China and Russia, intercontinental ballistic missiles. So this is something we couldn't stop even if we wanted to. One of the other benefits of using a nuclear EMP in wartime is the fact that it's not attributable. So if you detonate a nuclear weapon at the ground level or a surface burst, the next day there's going to be people in white suits and, vinyl out there scooping dirt, and we're going to know exactly which country that nuclear weapon came from. If you detonate this up in the atmosphere, we don't know. There's no way to know 100% exactly who attacked us. So defending ourselves and attacking them in return is very spurious. You're just not going to know exactly who it was that detonated this. So what are the effects of EMP? There are three different types of effects of EMP. You have the E1, E2, and E3 pulses that are emanated from a nuclear EMP attack. E2, we don't really discuss a lot. It's similar to lightning. Most electronics have lightning protection. Most houses have lightning protection at this point. The other two that you have to be concerned with are the E1 is an incredibly fast pulse, and this is going to affect most electronics in this country that have very small silicon microchips. And if you know, silicon microchips are they're in your toaster at this point. They're in everything. What percentage is very much open for debate. It's going to be a lot of them. We just don't know. Is it most? Is it some? Regardless, a lot of electronics are going to be fried. It depends on how far you were from the initial blast, what kind of resiliency was built into that machine. So that's the E1 pulse. It happens in like a nanosecond. It's very, very quick, coast to coast. And then the E3 pulse is kind of a longer pulse that happens between 1 and 5 seconds. And that kind of attaches to the Earth's magnetosphere, and it attaches to long line transmission lines. And that's going to come along and basically anything that's plugged into the grid at the time, anything that's electrified at the time, that's going to affect that. That will take down the U.S. electric grid. And it's not really up for debate. There are some people that would debate that, but the people that have the most knowledge, the Congressional EMP Commission, you mentioned Dr. Peter Pry, the people that wrote the original algorithms for the military for this, they all say the exact same thing. We will lose the national electric grid. And so yeah, that's the threat from an EMP. The reason this is so critical is that every aspect of human life today revolves around electricity. Every single aspect of your life requires electricity for it to function. All of our 16 critical infrastructures in this country must have electricity. The average military base, most people don't realize that 99% of the military bases in this country receive their electricity from the civilian electric grid. I've got DoD reports to Congress warning them that if we lose the civilian electric grid, the United States military will be without power within 24 to 48 hours of backup diesel that they have on site. They will run out of food within days, just like the average American. Their food arrives on those bases every 2 or 3 days on tractor trailers, just like the rest of the world. So they're going to be without food. They're going to be without power. A lot of times their septic and their water come from offsite, come from the nearby town. None of that's going to function. They have told Congress that if we lose civilian electric grid, they will be unable to respond to war or for societal collapse and helping out. So all these movies you see with people, box trucks passing out MREs, none of that is ever going to happen. So circling back real quick to my time at the EDTF, what you need to be aware of is there is zero plan at FEMA to deal with a national grid down event from this kind of an event. There is zero plan at the United States government to deal with the aftermath of a long-term grid down event. And there is zero plan at the United States military to deal with this kind of event. And that's really important to understand, is that this is a subject that has been proven by test data for 40, 50, 60 years since the Starfish Prime experiments. And the EMP Commission warned Congress in 2004 that 90% of the American people would be dead within a year if this was not addressed and the electric grid was not hardened and our high voltage transformers were not protected. And on top of that, we're just seeing the American government do literally nothing to respond to this. They're kicking the can down the road. 5 administrations. This is not political. This has nothing to do with left or right politics. This is equal opportunity, death and destruction. It doesn't matter your color, your skin, your religion, your social status. This will affect everybody the same. So a high altitude EMP attack is the worst case scenario for this country. And unfortunately, it's the one we're least protected against. And it's going to be, we can discuss more as far as foreign views on EMP and how these things are going to come into effect. But I believe this is something that we will most likely face at the beginning of World War III.
I think it's important that people understand what Starfish Prime was and what the effects of that were. Because I think there are some people who are still skeptical about the true capabilities of EMP weapons. Like myself personally, I think that if a government, the whole point of the philosophy of strategic deterrence is to put your cards on the table so nobody messes with you, right? You say, this is what we can do. There is a gap in public knowledge in terms of EMP weapons because, for one, it's not common knowledge at all. I think probably only 5% of the population is really aware of anything that we're talking about. And it's also not something that countries tend to brandish. Like, it's also not something that, we hear the Russians talking about, oh, we got this new nuke and it can have this massive EMP effect that will wipe out the grid. So I guess one of my questions to you would be, why aren't nation states talking this up a bit more and talking up the capabilities? If the purpose is strategic deterrence, why aren't they doing that sort of saber rattling with the EMP as opposed to just the nuclear weapon, if that makes sense?
Those are fantastic questions, and I seldom get those questions. So first of all, delivery methods. Which stops an all-out nuclear war is mutually assured destruction, right? They launch their missiles. We see them coming across. We launch ours, and we blow up the entire world. Nobody can live here. What's the point? Nobody. There's no winners, right? Everybody's a loser. The difference is in the philosophy on EMP. In fact, there's a great document from the Congressional EMP Commission in 2017 that Dr. Peter Pry penned called Foreign Views on EMP. And we looked, it's the unclassified version, but a lot of the information, there's enough information in there you can see from foreign countries' war doctrines that this is first strike territory for World War III. Every nuclear country, allied and enemy, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, a nuclear EMP is first strike doctrine for World War III. Because if you can win the entire war on day one without firing a single bullet, if you could take out your country's ability to make war from their homeland, you don't have to fight the war at that point. So that's important to understand. Iran considers this Sharia compliant in the sense that they don't actually kill a single person in their view. They detonate this weapon above the atmosphere, 300 kilometers, and it goes off, and nobody dies right then. They, in their war doctrine, say that our own arrogance and our dependence on electricity and the loss of our life skills is what kills us, right? So these are important things to understand, that this is not some sci-fi thing. This is not some... And I know you don't believe that, like this is never going to happen. There's lots of discussion on the world stage on the EMP threats. There have been multiple warnings. North Korea has come straight out and threatened EMP attack. A few years back, Iran, we were talking about delivery systems. Iran tested the detonation of an EMP weapon in the Caspian Sea off of a cargo ship with a K-Club missile launcher. So part of this is like, why aren't the American people finding out? It's because the media don't know information and they misreport. So when they did this testing, they used a Russian K-Club missile launcher. You can Google that or YouTube that and find out. It looks like a cargo container. It's like a transformer. At the push of a button, it opens up and, kind of like a transformer, and then it fires the rocket. So they did this test off a cargo ship. There's no reason for them to do that kind of test off a cargo ship if they didn't intend to drive that cargo ship somewhere to launch it, right? That missile went straight up in the air and detonated high up in the air. And the media reported that it was a misfire, that they were trying to hit some target somewhere and it was a misfire. But the truth of the matter is they were testing their EMP capability. And this was many, many years ago. So
how did they simulate an EMP if they didn't have nuclear capabilities?
They were detonating the ability to launch from the K-Club missile launcher from a cargo ship, and then that particular delivery rocket to reach the desired altitude. And it did not have a nuclear bomb on it, but it did detonate at high altitude. So that was what they were testing. They were just testing to make sure this rocket system to deliver an EMP did work. So they did not obviously detonate a nuclear weapon at that point.
And this thing was cloaked as a cargo ship.
Yes, it was fired from a cargo ship. Yes.
You know, it's interesting you say that because I recently watched an Iranian military parade. And one of the things I noticed was they had a lot of missiles that were inside these cargo trucks. And they were, you know, clearly sending a message there. I don't know what the message was, but that we can conceal weaponry inside civilian-looking ships and vehicles. So
Yeah, great. I would challenge everyone to go to the Center for Security Policy, which is a great ally to our cause. They have a document there called "The Perfect Storm." I think it's like 10 years old now. It was during the Obama administration. They gave power of our ports to a Muslim Brotherhood aligned group. I can't remember the Jafar group. Okay, so the Jafar group is I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but the Jafar Group also sits on the board of the Russian company that makes the K Club missile launchers. Okay. And if you go to YouTube and you watch the advertisements, it's the Club K missile launch system with Russia. They actually have a whole presentation of sneaking cargo containers into different countries you're getting ready to have war with, and they just sit there remotely. It doesn't take anybody on person, it's automated. When that war kicks off, they can press a button and either launch an EMP, which is the far end of that spectrum, but they can launch cruise missiles inside that country that can't be shot down. Like they can park these things on a farm 30 miles away from a big military base that they want to destroy. So this is a weapon delivery system that, again, American people aren't aware of. And the threat is that this Jafar group, I think, controls 2 of our ports at this point, and they have definitely terrorist ties. These type of delivery systems could be all throughout our country at this point. We just don't know. It is harder to sneak nuclear material through the ports, so I wouldn't say that the EMP delivery weapon is in the country, because we would pick that up through, radar and different things that we, there's specific planes that fly over the country and look for that type of stuff. So I doubt they're in here today, but it could be put on any cargo ship coming out of the Middle East into Houston down there and detonated. So delivery. So that's one source of delivery. The submarine, again, we would know that it was launched from the water per radar. So this is more likely China or Russia that have nuclear silent submarines that could launch, come up, launch, and go away. We would know it's probably one of them too, but yes, we've narrowed it down to 50-50 probably. But we still wouldn't know exactly for sure who it was at that point in time. You could do this with a high altitude balloon is possible. If you could get the nuclear weapon into the middle of the country on the ground, you could, very cheaply do this with a high altitude balloon. The intercontinental ballistic missile thing, the reason I do not believe that will be used, and a lot of the people in my industry don't believe that'll be used, is because we know where it came from. We're going to see it coming for 2 or 3 minutes, and we have the ability to shoot it down. Yes, Russia does have hypersonic, delivery systems at this point, but again, I believe that type of delivery vessel is going to we're going to know who attacked us, right? And we're going to immediately respond. So our nuclear triad is hardened against EMP. So a couple of the other questions you asked, kind of is, why aren't people talking about this? They are, it just doesn't make the media. So again, I would recommend Foreign Views on nuclear EMP threat by Dr. Pry. There's a lot of information in there, and that document's it's 6 years old at this point. However, you have to realize that all those reports that were released 2017 are the unclassified redacted versions. So there's more information there. We just don't know what it is, right? And the Russians have been talking about it. So I don't know if you remember back during the Obama administration, he spent $4 billion. And I give him credit for doing this. He spent $4 billion rehardening Cheyenne Mountain against EMP attack. And we moved NORAD back into Cheyenne Mountain during the Obama administration. This came not a long time after Roscoe Bartlett, Senator Bartlett, had met, and I'm trying to remember exactly who all was at the meeting. I think it was a couple senators from the intelligence community were meeting with their Russian counterparts. And in 2004, the Russians did warn us, and they did tell us at that point they had developed super EMP technology that could take out our most hardened EMP hardened facilities. So that's, again, another source of information that most people talk about EMP on YouTube, kind of the quote unquote prepper experts. They're going off the military protection standards 188-125, which anybody can download. Those standards were written back in 1981. I've met and I know the guys that wrote those original algorithms and wrote those standards. There's a reason why they're unclassified. There's a reason why you can download it on your computer. So a lot of times in the preparedness community, when people are talking about EMP hardening, they're talking about a standard from 1981, which was based on the Starfish Prime experiments and our test data from that, from those weapon tests. What they don't realize is that there are new EMP weapons that are much smaller, but they focus, they're like shaped charges. They focus all the gamma radiation back down. So in those original protection standards, the idea was to protect up to 80 to 85 kilovolts per meter is what you needed for protection. We believe at location, it'll be less the further away you get, but up to 200 kilovolts per meter. So a lot of the EMP protection standards, there are new military EMP protection standards. You can search it online and you can find the number that replaced 188-125. Those are standards they've been working 10 years on. But they're highly classified. They're TS2. You the right to know. Nobody's going to really have access to that. And one more point on this, and this goes into a lot of people will pull up available information. One of them is going to be the EPRI report. That's the Electric Policy Research Institute. That is the quote unquote science wing of the electric utilities, and they put out a couple science papers, one in 2016, one in 2019, minimizing the solar flare threat and the kind of the EMP and the grid coming down. They drastically underplayed the threat in those two reports, which you have to realize that's kind of like, taking the advice of the cigarette companies, when they would put out science saying cigarettes are good for your health back in the 50s, right? You're trusting the lobbying wing of the electric utilities that don't want regulated. So that science paper they put out has been thoroughly debunked by the EMP Commission and the Electromagnetic Defense Task Force. But they put that information out, and they only tested the transformers they were testing. They only went up to 24 kilovolts per meter. And the military is minimum 85 kilovolts per meter. So Sandia National Laboratory, who did the testing, they're a reputable place, but your test data, your conclusions are only as good as the data that you put in, the information that you put in, right? So when they did the test, they far undershot the threat. And so the 85 kilovolts per meter. One other point is I know the EMP Commission, when EPRI was writing this report, they offered to send the guys that were working on this EPRI report, and they said, hey, send us your guys. We'll get them top secret classification for this particular thing, and we'll show them the military and the classified foreign test data that we have that we've acquired that will show you that your test parameters are incorrect. EPRI wouldn't respond. They would not. They had no vested interest to see the data that would disprove their information. The EMP Commission's hands are tied because they can't release exactly the data because it's classified. So we're in this kind of catch-22. So people that minimize the threat of EMP and solar flare in a national grid down event are coming from a point of information that is only publicly accessible to them. If they would have sat in the same meetings that I've sat in the discussions that I've sat in at the highest levels of government, then they wouldn't be saying these things. Let's put it that way.
So you're saying that the capability, the threshold would be vastly exceeded by these new super EMP weapons, even for the hardening of the nuclear triad? Because what you're saying... What you're saying is
at that point in time, it would have, they have gone and they have rehardened our nuclear triad since then. Cheyenne Mountain, our nuclear triad. So we would have the ability, and we've got subs in the Pacific and the Atlantic at all times. So we would have the ability, if we knew where this came from, we'd have the ability to respond But then the question is NATO or the UN going to allow us to respond if they hit us with an EMP? Are they going to allow us to actually nuclear attack directly their country, or are they going to say, well, you can hit it with an EMP back? And then that gets into the question that Russia's grid is mostly hardened. China's on a fast track to harden their grid. We're the only ones not doing it. But anyways, yeah, I didn't mean to cut in, but
no. So you're saying that if a country was to utilize their best multiple super EMP weapons across the continental United States, that the only thing that would survive, as far as we know, would be the nuclear triad.
Correct.
Not necessarily the
military bases, nothing.
Right.
Most of the planes wouldn't function.
Okay, but these new, so the fact that the nuclear triad is hardened then is there is a possibility of a nuclear retaliation
Correct.
if they know who did it.
Yes.
Okay.
So that's kind of what the politicians are hanging their hat on. They're hanging their hat on that, and they're hanging and before 2019, when this EPRI report came out, I mean, there were many senators that would come to our conferences from the Secure the Grid Coalition, FBI's InfraGard, and Impact America. We were putting on conferences. We were warning the government, and we were having regular attendees. I think there was 3 or 4 bills that tried to get through Congress. They never made it out of committee because of the utility lobbying, utility money. We can get into that in a bit. But there was a lot more support. And then when this EPRI science paper came out saying, it's not that big of a deal, a lot of the politicians, even the true believers, there's just no political capital here. 99.99% of the American people, and I would probably guess the Canadian people as well, have no idea that the lights could go out, the power could go out permanently, long term. We're talking 2 to 3 years before we get our first transformers at port. So there's no upward pressure from the grassroots to pressure them to act.
So you were also saying about the Sharia compliance with Iran, testing the deployment mechanisms. And so what is your take on their nuclear capability? Do you think that they're just basically getting all of the deployment systems fine-tuned, and then ultimately, if they were ever faced with an existential crisis, they could immediately create a nuclear weapon and put it on one of these platforms? Or do you think they already have nuclear weapons?
So this is a debatable aspect. I believe they absolutely do already have nuclear weapons. 10 years ago, they were a couple of weeks away from having nuclear weapons. If you've ever seen the documentary 0 Days, or if you ever heard about the Stuxnet attack, well, technically Israel did on Iran and took down one of their facilities. That only set them back a couple months. I fully believe, outside the knowledge of the UN and NATO, that they do have nuclear weapons. Even if they did not, they have perfected their delivery systems. They have been testing their rockets, and even if not, they're only the level of enrichment of their material that they have now. They're only a couple weeks away from enriching it a little bit further, and then they would. So I believe, like you said, I'm a protege of Dr. Peter Pry, and he has access to information that I only wish I had access to. Yeah. But I believe they probably do. Real quick, one more point: the delivery systems. You mentioned satellites. Yes, that is absolutely another delivery method of detonating this. Right now, we have 2 satellites from North Korea that circle our country twice every day. They are at almost the exact height that you would need to set off an EMP. They've never sent a single digital signal back to North Korea. They're just kind of floating above there. Alongside the EMP Commission, do believe those are nuclear satellites that they could detonate at any point in time. Again, that is debatable, but that is another method of delivery.
So do you think the Iranians have hardened their grid for an EMP in light of the Israeli wielding the Samson option over their heads?
I believe most of the third world Muslim countries, I don't want to say third world, but the older Muslim countries like Iraq and Iran, they have older technology. Like looking at Russia, they have a lot of vacuum tubes and a lot of So there would be equipment destroyed, the laptops would be destroyed, but they would have the ability to rebuild. But their lifestyle and their delivery mechanisms, they are kind of beholden to the electric grid, but it wouldn't be it wouldn't be an end of civilization event for Iran if they lost electric grid. There'd be lots of suffering and starvation, but I believe that they would have the ability to recover as opposed to our country. So are they hardening the grid? I don't know of any intel for or against that as far as Iran's concerned. But the other thing you have to realize is that the Muslims, some of the Muslims, the more radicalized Muslims are trying to hasten the what is this, the sixth Imam, or they're willing to sacrifice their people to bring in the end of the world, to bring in the Muslim domination of the world. So there are questions as to where the Western countries, we're real concerned about our people, right? We don't want our people to die. I mean, we're watching Hamas hide civilians in the apartment buildings with their weapons, knowing they're going to die, not letting them leave. So they're willing to sacrifice a certain portion of their population to win the final battle. Let's put it that way.
What about deep underground bases? What is the depth that a military base has to be at so that it is spared the effects of a high voltage electromagnetic pulse?
Sure. So this is, man, I wish it's been a few years, but a geological organization, geological in a sense, they study the Earth's crust and rocks and stuff I don't understand, right? They put out some information. I have to find that study because NASA predicts that there's a 12% per decade chance of a solar flare, right?
Yeah.
And based off that threat, they did this test to kind of look at how a solar flare would interact with the Earth's magnetosphere and how it would react on ground. And what they discovered is that it's going to be far worse because there's a lot of different areas of the country with different rock strati structure where it's going to amplify it. Let's put it that way. It's going to amplify the destruction. I mean, you can try and read through this report and figure out which area of the country you live in, but regardless, it's going to take down the electric grid, period. So, but how deep?
Yeah, because I know a lot of these countries are burying a lot of stuff. Like they're putting stuff down deep, right? And I'm wondering if this is like as some protective barrier for an EMP, possibly.
So because of the nature of my private company, Grid Down Consulting, and working with clients, I mean, I have asked some of these questions from the EMP Commission engineers and the guys there at these meetings. My understanding is that 10 feet is not necessarily enough. Again, depending on how close you are to the initial strike, you know what I mean? So Atlas and Rising S and the bunker companies that I work with, for other clients, typically that 10 to 12 feet is typically where they're burying their stuff. That is not a guarantee enough dirt. If that's what you're asking me, how much dirt do you need to protect from EMP? I think it's subjective based on where you are, how close you are, the type of sand. There's a lot of moisture content. I mean, there's a lot of variables to give a definite answer to that question.
Yeah. Good stuff. Now, in terms of the proximity to the epicenter of this EMP blast, I read an article, I think I did a video on this probably about 2 years ago, and it was about how, if only a handful of transformers went down in the United States, even just with an asymmetrical style attack, never mind EMP, that this could potentially have a cascading effect throughout the entirety of the grid, bring the whole grid down. Maybe you could provide a bit more details about exactly how the EMP coupling into, even if it was just a few dozen transformers, likely more like several hundred, but how that would actually bring the grid down and why it would be so complicated for it to be built back up again.
So a nuclear EMP or solar flare event. So solar flare is very similar to EMP. It doesn't have the E1 portion, the fast that attacks very small microchips directly,
Yeah.
but it still has that coupling effect to things with antennas, long line transmission lines. And the E3 portion is what's really going to bring down the grid. The E1 is going to attack the laptops and different SCADA equipment that's protecting the grid and makes things function, which is very problematic. But the E3 portion of it is the side of the pulse that's going to you can go even in Canada up in Quebec 1989 you can look at pictures from that solar flare event and how it melted the windings in the high voltage transformer. We're talking about a big 400-ton behemoth piece of equipment here, high voltage transformer. And you can see it how how hot that thing got to melt those windings. So this would be a good time to discuss high voltage transformers because it is the Achilles heel of our nation and your nation as well. High voltage transformers must be present in the electric grid. I use the analogy like if you have a nuclear power plant and you have the power lines coming out of that facility, you can't just plug a toaster into that. That toaster is going to blow up, right? So you have these high voltage transformers when it comes out of the power generating facility, and then they step up the power and transmit it through your long line transmission network to reach different cities, different factories. And then at that next location, you have to have another high voltage transformer to step down power to usable loads. And then you have smaller transformers. As it gets out to a factory, you're going to get a certain amount. And then once you get into residential areas, it steps it down, either even further. But the high voltage transformers, there's about 3,000 of them. And again, I'm talking about America. There's about 3,000 of them in this country. They last a really long time. They got a long lifespan. So we only replace about 12 per year. And a majority of those, for many, many years, for decades, they came from South Korea and Germany, which are allied countries of ours. The thing that people need to understand is that today, on average, a couple of years ago before COVID, it was 12 to 24 months to get delivery at the port for a high voltage transformer. Today, because of just backups in supply and demand, it's up to 24 to 36 months before you would get a transformer on site. You can't have an electric grid. The power generation facilities, you cannot have an electric grid without these 400-ton behemoths. Each one's built to each specific location. So you can't just have, there's a certain variable and there is a way to have some spares that can fit different locations. They can't fit all locations because there's different demands for different cities. And then the question would be is what's the demand for the city if, half or a third of their electronics are fried or 2/3, how much demand is there going to be? So there's a lot of questions here. The point I'm getting at is you're not getting the first high voltage transformer on this country at the port for 2 years at this point in time. There's another conversation we have about Chinese transformers infiltrating, but we'll circle back to that. But so my point is that if an EMP or solar flare take out the electric grid, the electricity in this country is not coming back on for 2 years. The amount of death and destruction that comes 2 years of electricity, no interstate trucking, no food, no grocery stores, no banking, no radio, no TV, no internet, no heat, no AC, no septic systems functioning, nothing works. The death and destruction, even if one arrived at port 2 years from now, there's going to be, no one really alive. You can't pick up a phone and call a lineman to come deliver this thing and hook it up. So
yeah, and even if 2 years, that's in the best of times. That's, with a perfectly functioning, well-oiled supply chain. And then you're talking about there's a very good likelihood that if something happened here, it's not like the rest of the world, everything's going to be just functioning tip-top. So we must presume then that even if there is a colossal effort, like a government initiative to, bring back the transformers, like Operation Warp Speed for transformers or whatever, even if there is that, you're still probably looking at several years longer than that. Plus, if we're doing 12 a year and if hundreds go down, it's one of those situations where we're just not going to be able to deal with it probably for a decade if we do at all. We're talking about a civilization-ending event, and that's due to the lack of resilience in the system. But I'm sure you're going to talk at some point about how this problem can be mitigated by hardening the grid. But I think that's just something important for people to realize, that in the best of times, we're 24 to 36 months for 12 a year, right? So, and they have to, like you say, they have to be catered to the incoming power source. Are they using nuclear? Are they using hydro? Are they using, biofuels or whatever? And so each one is going to be different. There might, like you say, be some constants there. But so what about this effect of why is it that only a handful of these transformers going down would cause the entirety of the grid to potentially collapse?
Sure. So that would be because increasingly because of renewable energies that we're putting into the market. The smart grid technology, let's put it that way. A good place to start would be the Metcalfe substation attack. This was 8-9 years ago, maybe. There was a physical attack against a substation. There were 2 to 3 perpetrators. They went underground and cut the phone lines, cut the fiber optic cables to the facility beforehand, so they couldn't make a phone call. Somebody did have a cell phone. They were clearly monitoring the police channels because they left a minute before the police showed up. And they were the organization that did a investigation after the fact discovered triangle-shaped piles of rocks from their firing locations, which is something that's used over in the Middle East to signify kind of like sniper positions. And they used AK-47s. They shot up a high-voltage transformer. There was not a single fingerprint found on any of the shells. The FBI has no clue to this day who perpetrated this attack. They fired at, I don't want to get into the specifics of what they did wrong, just because I don't want to put that information out there. But the piece of infrastructure they fired at, it slowly overheated the transformer and burned it up. So there was a signal at the nearby facilities. They were saying, "Oh, this is going down," and they had a very short period of time. They were able to reroute electricity around that substation. What people don't realize is we were a couple minutes away. If they would have attacked a different part of that facility, or if they wouldn't have been able to reroute power in time, Silicon Valley would have been down 1 to 2 months before it would have got power back up. Could you imagine Silicon Valley with no power? They were, this was 8 or 9 years ago, but no Facebook, no, a lot of your internet would be down. A lot of your websites would be down for a month or two. This would be a big story, right? People would take it seriously. Things would get fixed. So we believe that this was a dry run by terrorists, a cell in this country. That is I would say that it is the common sense answer to this. If we want to start talking about the southern border and the fact that over just the last 2 years, 70,000 plus special interest aliens, those are illegal immigrants from countries that we considered problematic, that we don't really want here, have been captured at the border. And those are just the ones we captured. And we only capture the fraction of the people that cross the border. So, I mean, there could be up to 100,000 people from these countries, even if it was a small percentage. Yes, a lot of them are coming here for jobs and whatever else, but even if a small percentage of them were terrorists, the after report of the Metcalfe substation, and again, I want to be careful what I put out here on the internet, is as few as 9 substations, if they were attacked at the same time, could bring down the entire country. Everything's interconnected because, and I was mentioning earlier, smart grids and renewable technology, we're operating more and more at peak physical load, like right at the barrier. That's why when you have a cold snap in Texas, the grid goes down. That's why when you have fires in California, the grid can come down, rolling blackouts. These are things that are going to become more problematic. The government's aware of this. You can watch the C-SPAN coverage of NERC and FERC discussing this in front of Congress, and Congress telling them, this is crazy. And the CAFE standards and the renewable energy standards we're pushing into our electric grid. We're decommissioning reliable coal power plants. There's so much subsidies to start wind and solar, which I'm not necessarily against. I'm just saying that they're a lot less reliable than these other methods. So we're having to interconnect our grids a lot more. And so when there's peak load and the solar panel farm near you can't, we got to pull power from a coal power plant, 2 states away. So there's all this interconnection that's happening, and that makes us more vulnerable to a solar flare and EMP taking down the whole system than if we had microgrids or we were separated. And there's a lot more division on the electric utilities.
It's interesting. You just made me think about something. It's kind of like a just-in-time delivery system, but for electricity. And you see, yes, when the grocery store runs dry, there's only about 3 days worth of food in that grocery store because they don't keep any extra supply in the back anymore. And like you're saying, with respect to coal-fired plants, while they might pollute more and while they might be, kind of like a combustion engine, you can just go and fill it up at the gas station. You don't have to wait 8 hours for the thing to charge, type thing. So there's that component, the interconnectedness, and that's great information because it explains a lot in terms of the vulnerabilities of the system. Now, is there a possibility, we're talking about high altitude nuclear detonations, is there a possibility that a terrorist group could, say, utilize a localized EMP weapon on a transformer?
Oh, absolutely. Directed energy weapons. Again, there's a whole nother report from the 2017 commission Dr. Pry wrote on directed energy EMP weapons, and they're easily available. I wouldn't say easily. You're not going to pick one up at Walmart, but they're not hard to put together. The technology to build them is out there on the internet. You can basically buy basic parts and build a directed energy EMP weapon. So again, that's riskier. That's riskier because you can get caught in the act. Again, if it's a Muslim terrorist organization, they're willing to die for their beliefs, as we've seen in 9/11. But he made the case of just building a handful of these in this country, which would be far easier than hijacking airliners and crashing them into buildings. Building a handful of these and having some guys in a box truck drive around for a day, taking down high voltage transformers. Yeah, you could fry the grid pretty quick doing that.
Yeah, and so this idea that you only need to take down, I think, 9 transformers, I think that was in the documentary with Dennis Quaid there, where they talked about that. Is it any 9 transformers, or is it
no?
Like
that is as few as 9. So those are 9 specific transformers, and that's class. That's obviously where that's not going to be released. But a dozen, 15, 20. Right. At the right locations. And again, how the electric grid functions is not classified. You can go online and figure out exactly where the high voltage transformers is, the direction of flow of power, how the power in North Carolina a couple of years ago, we saw that guy shoot up a transformer and take down power for that one town in North Carolina. Again, from my understanding, he looked at electric utility maps of where the power was coming into that town that he wanted to take down.
Yeah, and you said something interesting too about Silicon Valley and all the servers and, just how interconnected our world is, how reliant we are on the internet. Even if power wasn't out where we are, a lot of the services that we've come to rely on that we're accessing remotely in the cloud would not be available, and that could create a huge just disruption in services, in commerce, trade, just social media, fog of SHDF type thing. So I'm not sure if we address this, but just what is China and Russia's, that, as far as obviously, a lot of this is going to be classified, but what is the state of their preparedness when it comes to hardening their own grids, be it North Korea, China, Iran, Russia?
So there, again, we only have what's available to. I only have available to what's open source writing material. The general assumption at this point in time is that Russia is largely hardened against the EMP threat, just because they've never done this smart grid, attached a bunch of computers. Their electric grid is like still
Analog.
150 years old, knobs,
Yeah.
levers, tubes, so their equipment is just a lot more hardy. Again, there's going to be disruption. I'm sure there's going to be issues, and you can still fry the laptop that's plugged into the grid, right? And some of the SCADA equipment, things like that. So I'm not saying they're completely protected, but they are largely hardened is the consensus in our industry. China has years ago has been talking about the kind of the view is that at some point they're going to go after Taiwan, right? At some point they're going to try and snatch that up. And they've known this for years. We've known this for years, even though it wasn't maybe discussed 5 or 6 years ago. But there are reports that you can read, like public reports, where they recognize that the future is EMP, that the future is cyber attacks on grids and infrastructure and EMP. And they started a fast tracking program to harden their grid many years ago. So we don't know what the state, how far they've reached. Obviously, China is much more a electronic society than maybe as much as the bulk of Russia is. So at least their cities are right in China. So there's difficulties in hardening that kind of infrastructure, right? We just don't know how far they've gotten. But yes, they are aware of it, and through public documents, we do know that they have a fast track program to harden their grid.
Yeah, and you would think that having the industry that they've developed would allow them to bounce back quicker than we could, because of course we don't manufacture these things, whereas they might have the industrial means to do so after a grid down event.
Yeah, so I mean that kind of goes to a question. A lot of times people are like, well, if they completely destroy us, why haven't they done it already? Well, because of that mutually assured destruction, not so much on the nuclear front, but in the instance of we buy all their stuff. Like if China were to hit us with an EMP tomorrow, just because, right? The entire global system would crash. We buy everybody's stuff here in this country, and Europe does too. But China wants to win. China wants to be the new world superpower. So does Russia, right? But they want us to be in that system. They just want to be above us, right? If they completely destroy our country and take our buying power and our wealth out of the global system, yeah, they may become kings, but they're going to be kings of an anthill, right? The leftover global system, the trade system, it's just not going to be what it was. So they want to win more so than destroy everything, right? And you have to realize if they did this to us, since they built all of our stuff, a lot of their factories would be going down. Their people would be starving because their economy is going to crash as well. So for that reason, that's why it hasn't happened yet. However, don't let that lull you into the sense of like if World War III kicks off and for 1 second they think they're going to lose, I don't question for a second that they're going to hit that button and take us out. So I think they'd rather destroy our country with an EMP as opposed to lose a war to us also, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I also think that just because the nature of the cultural differences, that they are more of a resilient society than we will be, as are most, just because a lot of the bureaucracy and the red tape in democratic societies. In the best of times, I always say that democratic societies will typically thrive more, but in the worst of times, an authoritarian society is actually more resilient in a lot of ways, because they're less averse to throwing bodies at the problem, and more. I mean, just historically with the Soviet Union and the Chinese, they're willing to sacrifice, to break a few eggs to make an omelet, if you know what I mean. Whereas in democracies, we're more casualty averse, and I think this is something that Peter Pry talked about a lot as to why the Russians were maybe a little bit more, I don't want to say more inclined to the nuclear option, but that they would be quicker to utilize it if they had to, because of their history of self-sacrifice, and they know we are more casualty averse. And, I mean, the most amount of guys we lose in a conflict is in the thousands, so, we just simply have no conception of human life loss on that scale, whereas that is something which is ingrained in their history. So
you're 100% correct. We're watching that in Ukraine right now. They're winning by attrition. Ukraine's only got so many male military age bodies in their country, and we're watching Russia just they're just sitting back. They're willing to throw bodies at it because they got a lot more bodies than Ukraine. I mean, we've seen this throughout world history. Stalin, Mao, Hitler. They're willing to lose guys for that, for winning the war. You're absolutely correct. And so as far as the resiliency of the overall people, I think we're getting close to even the third world countries. A lot, they rely on electricity, a lot of them too. So yes, you're going to have very rural areas, the rice fields of China, that may not skip a whole lot, if this type of event happens. But I would say almost every city person living in China at this point, they're multiple generations removed from understanding how to grow their own food, dig root cellars, harvest, store their food. So as a nation, yes, overall in America, that's different because we are the richest country in the world. We've had electricity for a very long time. We've had peace and prosperity. Even the country people, I mean, I live very remotely, and even the country people that live around me, that garden and stuff, they don't have the life skills to make it through this type of scenario long term without prior planning, without having equipment and long term food to make it through to harvest season. They don't live. I don't know a single. I know they exist, so you don't have to email me. I know these people exist, but I've never met a person that lived strictly off the food they grow. Everybody I know goes to the grocery store. I grew up in Amish country. The Amish are at the grocery store every day, or you see them there all the time, right? So. And I'm not saying the Amish don't have the life skills. They'd be the one group that does have the life skills to survive this type of scenario. The problem being is they're pacifists. And when the surrounding towns around the Amish people run out of food and they start starving and dying, the Amish people are going to get run over pretty quickly. But moral of that story is if you can attach yourself to an Amishman, for protection, if you're willing to own the guns and have them provide the life skills, that'd be a good scenario if you live in that area. What's most likely to happen is the people that are going to be coming for your food are going to be people you know and you love, or that it's going to be coworkers and friends and family and extended family. Now, instead of a family of 5, you've got 25 people. You're out of food in a week.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, where you'll find high-quality survival gear at the best prices, no junk, and no gimmicks. Use discount code PREPPINGGEAR for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive, but the prepared thrive. Stay safe.